Okay, the next step is to lift the vehicle into the air, and the lift point we're using is towards the front of the car, right in front of the subframe connector. And this is kind of on that frame type bar that's on the car. And we're actually lifting on the front of the car, but we're doing this to get the rear in the car as well. So we'll show you. Okay, so we've lifted the car up in the front, and now we're going to take our jack stand and we're going to put it in the rear. There's a torque box right here, and that's going to be our spot. So now we're just lifting on the opposite side so we can get the other end up. And a lot of people will lift right on the rear differential to get it up in the back faster. And I've seen people do it a lot, and I don't think it hurts anything, but it just says not to do it in the manual. So for this video, we're just doing it this way. But basically what we're doing here is just getting the rear tires off the ground so that we can remove the drive shaft. Okay, so now we have the car off the ground in the rear. We're going to be able to move the rear wheels and turn the drive shaft. And that's going to be our next step, is removing the drive shaft. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is remove the drive shaft. And to do that, we're going to take off these 4 bolts right here. And as you can see, some of the bolts, unless they're on the bottom here, they're not going to be easily exposed. So what we're doing is we're putting this 12 millimeter socket on here. The multiple points on the socket match up with this bolt. And we're breaking it loose. Then we're going to release the parking brake, have the car out of gear, and then turn the drive shaft to expose the next bolt. And so we're going to then pull the parking brake up, break the next one loose, and just repeat the process. So here's the first one. Basically right here, we're just going to break it, and we're going to turn it lefty-loosey. Okay, so that's going to loosen it. There we go. So we broke the first drive shaft bolt loose, and now we want to turn the drive shaft, so we're going to put the car into neutral. Make sure it's in neutral, and then we're going to release the parking brake. So now with the parking brake off and the out of gear, I can turn it to expose the next bolt. Then I'll tell my buddy to pull the e-brake. That'll lock it into place, and then we can break loose the next one and repeat the process. Okay, so now we're just removing the drive shaft bolts. They've all been exposed and they've been broken loose. And you can take them out as soon as you do break them loose too, just at the same time if you want. But the drive shaft is still being held on because it's on a little bit of a lip here. And so then our next step, once all the bolts are free, is to just move it back a little bit and drop it down. Now sometimes these bolts can be really hard to get off, and just a technique that we wanted to illustrate here, if you can't get it off of the breaker bar, you can put a solid box end wrench onto the bolt and then down on the front of a jack. And then very carefully, as you lift the jack, it'll turn the bolt and break it loose. Okay, sometimes even a breaker bar, you aren't going to have enough strength to get this off, like in this case. So what you can do is take the handle from your jack, slide it onto the back of the breaker bar, and that extends the length of the handle. That'll give you more torque, okay? So that was how we were able to break this off. And it's called a cheater bar. It's also safer than using the wrench. Remember with the wrench that you're putting a lot of pressure if you use that technique, and that's mainly just to break it loose. Don't be trying to put too much force on that wrench if you lift it with a jack. With all the bolts removed, you can now pull the drive shaft towards the front of the car and then set it down onto the ground. If you were to pull the drive shaft out of the transmission, you would lose transmission fluid. Now we have the yoke and the pinion nut are exposed, and that's as far as we're going to go with here, but you can see where the drive shaft was, and so when you put it back on, just make sure it matches up to those bolts. Now something we really like to do is label every bolt that we take off and put it inside these plastic bags. So here we just wrote drive shaft bolts on this bag, and we're just going to put all 4 bolts in there. And it's a good way to keep them all together, because when you're taking so many bolts apart, especially with the transmission, you'll find that a lot of bolts will fit in spots that they shouldn't go. So this is a good way to keep everything separated.